Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is blaming Russia for a massive cyber attack on the U.S. Mr. Pompeo is the highest-ranking Trump administration official to publicly tie the Kremlin to the breach. He said in an interview that Russia is, quote, pretty clearly behind the attack. President Trump is finally weighing in on the matter as well. He is downplaying it. In a tweet, he said he has been fully briefed on the situation and that everything is, quote, well under control. He also contradicted his Secretary of State by suggesting China may be responsible. U.S. officials say the attack was discovered last week. The extent of the damage is still unknown. At least 7 governmental agencies are impacted, including the State, Energy, Treasury, and Homeland Security departments. Catherine Herridge has more.
Sources tell CBS News the hack is believed to be the largest cyber espionage campaign in U.S. history, and it's not over.
This was really an attack of massive scale.
Microsoft's president told us today the hack spans at least 8 countries, with 80% of the targets in the U.S., including many of the company's clients.
This attack is still taking place. The industry is scrambling. People in government are scrambling to get it under control, but it's not under control yet.
Among the concerns that the breach at the Treasury Department may have exposed taxpayer information. What's the impact?
Well, the impact is extraordinary. Any information of yours may have been compromised by very sophisticated attackers.
Officials say the tactics are similar to other large-scale attacks blamed on Russia, but investigators can't rule out other foreign adversaries.
Are we going to learn that the hack was even bigger than we know right now?
Well, we should assume that the number of victims is going to increase. This is a bit like a natural disaster.
Sources say the hackers could have roamed free in unclassified systems and impersonated high-level officials seeking classified information. Catherine Herridge, CBS News, Washington.
For more on this, let's bring in Erica Borghard. She's a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. Erica, thanks for joining us. What do the severity and scope of this data breach say about our nation's current cyber strategy?
Thanks so much. I'm excited to be here. I think it's understandable that the SolarWinds hack has raised some really important questions about how effective U.S. cyber strategy is. And one thing that stands out to me is that a number of people are pointing to this breach as an example of the failure of deterrence. But personally, I would disagree with that characterization. Deterrence is a strategy we all know well from the Cold War. It's about preventing an adversary from taking some unwanted action by credibly threatening to punish them if they follow through on it. And deterrence does play a big role in America's cyber strategy, but it's not a great fit for this kind of hack. And that's because despite a lot of the terminology calling this a cyber attack, it wasn't actually a cyber attack. Instead, it was an example of a very successful, very important intelligence operation that was conducted for national security purposes. And the reality is that we simply don't try to deter these kinds of hacks because espionage is something that all states, including the United States, does. And I would say that a good analogy is the Office of Personnel Management breach back in 2014, where China purportedly stole information about millions of federal government employees and their families. And when news of the OPM hack broke, the director of national intelligence at the time said something to the effect of, you have to kind of salute the Chinese for what they did. In other words, cyber espionage is something that all states try to do. This doesn't mean that the SolarWinds hack was not significant. It certainly was, but it's not a cyber attack. And so for me, this means that it's not a failure of our deterrence strategy, but rather an intelligence failure.
Erica, it's really interesting because you're framing it in a very different way than we've heard most people discuss it, that it's not an attack so much as it is espionage. And we know that the U.S. engages in cyber espionage on other countries. So how does this hack compare to those American efforts? And if we were to reframe our thinking, as you suggest, how do we then interact with other countries? If we're spying on them and they're spying on us, should we be thinking about this in an entirely different way in terms of repercussions?
That's a great question. So I realize that my position may be a bit different from sort of the conventional view. And just to clarify, the reason why I wouldn't characterize this as a cyber attack is because it didn't involve yet any sort of disruptive or destructive effects. And so that's why it's an example of cyber espionage. That said, the game isn't over because the breach is ongoing, and we don't yet have enough information about what the ultimate motivation of the threat actor is, right? So there's a potential that it could turn into a cyber attack. And so the US government should marshal its resources to collect better intelligence about what the ultimate objective is and try to sort of deter Russia from crossing that red line into a cyber attack. But in the meantime, I think that the response on the part of the United States has to focus more on improving counterintelligence efforts, conducting sort of incident response at a scale that the U.S. government hasn't done previously because this incident is unique in its scope and its scale. And then also signaling to Russia, which at this point seems to be the likely culprit behind this incident, that turning this from espionage into a cyber attack is something that would cross a red line and something that we would try to deter.
Well, Erica, the president says that everything is well under control, but officials say that the breach is ongoing. What is, in fact, the truth there, and what type of national security risk are we actually facing?
So I think the truth is that this is significant. It seems to be ongoing, and we don't quite have a handle on the extent of the damage and what the scale of this breach actually is. And so in terms of thinking about the national security risks of the situation, I would organize it into sort of two categories. And the first one I spoke to previously. The breach is ongoing. We don't yet know enough about what the ultimate aim of the operation is to know whether the purpose is to steal information for espionage purposes or whether there could be some follow-on cyber attack. And that's because to conduct most types of cyber attacks, you have to gain access to a network or a system to be able to then do that follow-on attack. And so, as I mentioned, here's where deterrence plays an important role. And so the U.S. should be leveraging its resources to gather intelligence about what this operation is for, to deter Russia from taking any further action that would constitute a cyber attack. And that's something that would disrupt the functioning of U.S. government or critical infrastructure systems, manipulate or destroy data, or similar types of actions. So that's the first risk, is that this isn't just espionage, there may be a follow-on attack. The second risk is what Russia might do with the intelligence it's collected. And again, we don't know the full extent of what's been compromised. And Russia could leverage this information for its own foreign policy objectives, whether it's to help Russia learn more about U.S. policies against its interests, to help Russia with its own counterintelligence efforts, to learn about U.S. decision-making processes and key personnel, and so on and so forth. So again, just because right now this incident is not an attack doesn't mean that it doesn't have some really significant national security consequences.
So I guess I'm going to just re-ask that question one more time, Erica. Well, I appreciate what you're saying. I think people are still scratching their heads. This breached 7 government agencies, big, important government agencies. It went all the way back to March and was undetected for this entire time. We don't know exactly what they've gotten at this point, or, as you said, if other attacks might be forthcoming. Is this situation under control? Despite the fact that it's widespread, is this really serious? How concerned are we supposed to be about this cyber espionage or cyber attack, however you want to describe it? How big a deal is this fundamentally? Where do we go from here?
So I think this is a big deal. I certainly am not trying to minimize the significance of this. It's a really big deal. And what makes it a big deal is the fact that through sort of a third-party supply chain breach, Russia seems to have been able to gain access to sort of a wide range of federal government and private sector systems and networks. And so it is ongoing. We don't know the full scope and scale of it. So immediate action needs to be taken to sort of marshal the resources of the U.S. government and collaborate better with the private sector to do incident response, to have confidence that these threat actors are out of our networks and that the damage has been contained. So there's an enormous effort that needs to be done. And so over the long term, I think we also need to rethink how we think about securing federal government networks, right? To take it apart and build it back better with security best practices. This should be a watershed moment for thinking about federal cybersecurity.
All right, Erica Borghard, appreciate you coming on and helping to explain this for all the rest of us who are still trying to figure it all out.
Thank you so much. It was great being here.